guys, today my informational presentation is going to be on minorities in production. I chose this topic because I would like to highlight the history of minorities in productions both on screen and off, because it has been an amazing history for them. How do you well, I skipped the other one, so there we go. So I wanted to start from the beginning, which was before minorities were allowed on stage. And during this time of people performing, they had the Jim Crow laws, which allowed a lot of, well, it didn't allow a lot of minorities to be a part of certain things, for example, theater. And because of this, a lot of Americans at the time still wanted to use them in their productions. So when they did this, they painted their faces black and performed on stage. While they did this, they would make up like songs that would like make fun of what they would do. Like it was very like demeaning for the African Americans at the time. They would portray them as like almost like animals, you know, like they would make them seem like so like gruesome and like horrid, but you know, like they couldn't really do anything at the time because of the fact that they were under slavery. And this lasted from like the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And I got this information from a look at the American musical theater. Just kidding. Early representation, as minorities began to lead their way into these productions, both Hollywood on screen and Broadway on stage, they were in it a lot, but they tended to play stereotypical roles. For example, West Side Story, a lot of the Puerto Rican actors who were portraying the roles, they had very thick accents. They were people who made dresses, and when they went to dance, you wouldn't see them doing the hand jive. You would see them doing a very like authentic, like very cultural dances instead of, you know, like fitting in with other of the cast members in the film. In the production. Although this was a big deal during the time, we still see this a lot in our own productions today. For example, I was thinking of Modern Family on the way here while I was trying to present it in my head. How Sofia Vergara plays the typical gold digger, exotic, very thick accent. She's very very dumb to play. Like she doesn't really act as smart as her other co-stars do. However, today they have made a much bigger standpoint. We have numbers that are rising in their Oscar-winning nominations. For example, Guillermo del Toro won his Oscar for Best Director and Best Film for Shape of Water, which was a huge thing for Hispanics, because this was one of the few Oscars that we usually win. And for example, Lupita Nyong'o 2 years ago won Best Supporting Actress for a film in 12 Years a Slave. And for Broadway, we have Hamilton, and Hamilton in itself was just completely like turning the tables, because Lin-Manuel, when he was calling for a casting for this show, he said that he wanted specifically minorities for each and every role, when however the people he was portraying in history were all white. And when he was asked why he did this, he said, authorial intent wins, period. And in other words, he's saying that it doesn't matter what color the person is, anyone can play any certain role, because it's the person who's doing it that helps portray the person that's being portrayed. So in conclusion, I chose this topic once again to highlight the role that minorities have in production and in theater. Although yes, they have made a very heavy impact, there's still a very long ways to go. They are helping the newer generation of actors and actresses become as good as or even better than them, and slowly we're giving each and every one of our races equal show and production. And that's my presentation.
Okay, David, what did you think? Give us your thoughts.
It was very interesting, and the way you started it also had, you could have worked like a little bit more, like giving some backstory or backstory. Also, like maybe add some like statistics to see how that has changed throughout the years, like how it was back then and how it is now. There were, but you did use the images very well, the topic as well. You stayed on point. Pretty good. That's pretty much it. You did well.
All right, well, you gave us the topic and the title card and no attention device at the beginning of the speech, and you introduced yourself, so you got a couple of strikes against you at the beginning. We do know what the topic is, that's pretty good. You have a reasonably clear thesis statement. I think you can do a little bit more to justify why it is that you're talking about this, rather than simply, kind of looking at it from your own personal perspective. Why should everybody care about this? Why should it be important? And there's no preview of what the supporting structure is going to be, so I don't know exactly how it's going to develop. Now, it does appear that it's going to be chronological, because the very first supporting point that you do have in the speech is a reference to early forms of entertainment, and you talk about minstrel shows. The description of the minstrel shows it feels a little incomplete. Honestly, it sounds like you did a small amount of research, but you need to, you kind of had a vague reference to a source that you presented here, but it didn't sound like you were quoting the source directly. At best, it sounded like a paraphrase, and the source, I think, the citation needs to be a heck of a lot clearer earlier in the presentation. And that seemed to be kind of the last of the sources that we got. There's some factual data in the rest of the speech that is perfectly fine, but it's, I don't think it's particularly controversial when you're talking about who won the Academy Awards in the last few years. I'm not sure that that's a big deal when it comes to citing sources there. But the information about earlier time periods in the movies or restrictions, and you make references to Jim Crow laws, that's all stuff that I think you need to have a little bit more information on. There's at one point where you're kind of describing what it is that the dancing styles were like, and how they weren't really reflective of the culture that people came from. And to be honest with you, I didn't quite understand that reference. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it's based on. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more clarity on that. And that's another one of those things where I think some citation would be helpful there. In the body of the speech, I can tell where the organizational structure is, because you do have kind of periods of time that you're referring to, and the visuals also give us a prompt there. To me, that was the thing that was most useful about the visuals, is that they tell me what section of the speech I'm in. And they help give the transitions more than anything else in the presentation. So it's easy to follow along because the visuals kind of structure things for us also. So they're doing something that's helping the speech, but I don't know that after you get past identifying the section there that they add much to it. There's a little bit of interest that's created by some of those things, although I think it would be easy to find some other interesting things to show on each of those points. And you have a lot of, you've got more than 3 minutes left. You don't use more than 5 minutes in the presentation, so it's not like you don't have the time to add a little bit of content to each of those points. You've got the poster there, for instance, of the minstrel show, and I'm wondering, well, how widespread were the minstrel shows? Were they primarily in the South where they were doing that and the Jim Crow laws existed? Because you didn't have Jim Crow laws in other parts of the country, or did they not have minstrel shows anyway because they just generally didn't like having blacks or former slaves participating in the entertainment? I just think I needed some more information on that. And the one that you showed, was that the most prominent one? How many troops were there? That kind of thing. That's a little bit of detail that's going on there. When you mention the presence of people of different ethnicities in films mid-century. You know, for instance, you've got the picture from West Side Story there, and you're talking about the Puerto Ricans. Are they portrayed by Puerto Ricans? Are the accents heavy? Was that the way it was written? Was that the way they were directed to do it? Did they have naturally heavy accents? I don't know what's going on here, except that, you know, there's a very brief reference to that particular film or play. And other than that, it feels a little bit thin. I mean, that's basically your example from the middle part of your speech. And it feels like there's not as much substance there as there needs to be. The contemporary references, you talk about some changes that have taken place. You make a reference to the Academy Awards. I think that's fine. For instance, this would be one of those places where a little bit of statistical research would be helpful. What percentage of Academy Award winners would be identifiable as being classified as an ethnic group or an ethnic minority or something like that? Up until a particular point, when did it start changing? When did we have more numbers? You mentioned Guillermo del Toro, for instance, at the end, and I just thought this is an interesting time because you missed one of the most obvious pieces of information change here that's going on. 4 of the last 5 Academy Award winners have been from other places and different ethnicities. You know, I shouldn't say ethnicities other than white, you know, as the saying goes. We have one white guy who is not ethnic, you know, not Hispanic or something like that in the last 5 years. The other 4 have all been something else. You know, and it seems to me like that would be something that you could point out and make a big deal about. Same sort of thing with the actors, for instance. You could say that they were all lily white, with one exception prior to 1965 or 62, and then you get a couple of smattering here and there of nominees. But when it comes to winners, we don't start getting more winners until. And it would be easy to show, like with a bar graph, the progressive change that's going on there, or something like that that makes it a little bit more full, as opposed to, you know, the pictures are okay, but you know, they're not the information that you need. They're the thing that gives it some interest and color and invigorates it a little bit, but they don't explain anything. And you need something that explains, I think, a little bit more. And then I'm going to yell at you. You get the Porky Pig exit. You know, it's like, that's all, folks. You want a better exit line then, and I guess that's it. That's my presentation. So it kind of starts with, well, here's my speech today, and it finishes with, well, that was my speech. And it's the exact opposite of the 2 things that we talked about doing. So I'm going to slap you with a wet noodle and tell you not to do that again. Okay, thank you.